Well, hello there. Welcome back to A People's Historian, where we read about 30 minutes of history. I'm Jason Kishinev. We're reading we're going to finish up chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And let's just dig in and get right to it. Hosea Hudson, a black man from rural Georgia, at the age of 10 a plowhand, later an iron worker in Birmingham, was aroused by the case of the Scottsboro Boys in 1931. 9 black youths Well, hello there. I'm Jason Kishinev, and welcome back to A People's Historian, where we read about 30 minutes out of a history book every episode. We are going to finish up chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States, and let's just dig in and get right to it. Hosea Hudson, a black man from rural Georgia, at the age of 10 a plowhand, later an iron worker in Birmingham, was aroused by the case of the Scottsboro Boys in 1931. 9 black youths accused of raping 2 white girls and convicted on flimsy evidence by all-white juries. That year he joined the Communist Party. In 1932 and 1933 he organized unemployed blacks in Birmingham. He recalls, "Deep in the winter of 1932, we party members organized an unemployed mass meeting to be held on the old courthouse steps on 3rd Avenue, North Birmingham. It was about 7,000 or more people turned out, Negroes and whites. In 1932 and 33, we began to organize these unemployed block committees in the various communities of Birmingham. If someone get out of food, we wouldn't go around and just say that's too bad. We make it our business to go see this person. And if the person was willing, we'd work with them. Block committees would meet every week, had a regular meeting. We talked about the welfare question, what was happening. We read the Daily Worker and the Southern Worker to see what was going on about unemployed relief, what people doing in Cleveland, struggles in Chicago, or we talk about the latest developments in the Scottsboro case. We kept up. We was on top, so people always wanted to come because we had something different to tell them every time." Hold on. In 1934 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of workers, left out of the tightly controlled, exclusive unions of the American Federation of Labor, began organizing in the new mass production industries, auto, rubber, packing house. The AFL could not ignore them. It set up a committee for industrial organization to organize these workers outside of craft lines by industry, all workers in a plant belonging to one union. This committee, headed by John Lewis, then broke away and became the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. But it was rank-and-file strikes and insurgencies that pushed the union leadership, AFL and CIO, into action. Jeremy Brecher tells the story in his book, Strike! A new kind of tactic began among rubber workers in Akron, Ohio in the early 30s, the sit-down strike. The workers stayed in the plant instead of walking out, and this had clear advantages. They were directly blocking the use of strike breakers. They did not have to act through union officials, but were in direct control of the situation themselves. They did not have to walk outside in the cold and the rain, but had shelter. They were not isolated, as in their work or on the picket line. They were thousands under one roof, free to talk to one another, to form a community of struggle. Louis Adamic, a labor writer, describes one of the early sit-downs. Sitting by their machines, cauldrons, boilers, and workbenches, they talked. Some realized for the first time how important they were in the process of rubber production. 12 men had practically stopped the works. Superintendents, foremen, and straw bosses were dashing about. In less than an hour, the dispute was settled. Full victory for the men. In early 1936, at the Firestone rubber plant in Akron, makers of truck tires, their wages already too low to pay for food and rent, were faced with a wage cut. When several union men were fired, others began to stop work, to sit down on the job. In one day, the whole of plant number 1 was sitting down. In 2 days, plant number 2 was sitting down, and management gave in. In the next 10 days, there was a sit-down at Goodyear. A court issued an injunction against mass picketing. It was ignored, and 150 deputies were sworn in, but they soon faced 10,000 workers from all over Akron. In a month, the strike was won. The idea spread through 1936. In December of that year began the longest sit-down strike of all, at Fisher Body Plant number 1 in Flint, Michigan. It started when 2 brothers were fired, and it lasted until February 1937. For 40 days there was a community of 2,000 strikers. It was like war, one said. The guys with me became my buddies. Sidney Fine in Sit Down describes what happened. Committees organized recreation, information, classes of postal service, sanitation. Courts were set up to deal with those who didn't take their turn washing dishes, or who threw rubbish or smoked where it was prohibited, or brought in liquor. The punishment consisted of extra duties. The ultimate punishment was expulsion from the plant. A restaurant owner across the street prepared 3 meals a day for 2,000 strikers. There were classes in parliamentary procedure, public speaking, history of the labor movement. Graduate students at the University of Michigan gave courses in journalism and creative writing. Right on. There were injunctions, but a procession of 5,000 armed workers encircled the plant, and there was no attempt to enforce the injunction. Police attacked with tear gas, and the workers fought back with fire hoses. 13 strikers were wounded by gunfire. That's not funny. But the police were driven back. The governor called out the National Guard. By this time, the strike had spread to other General Motors plants. Finally, there was a settlement. A 6-month contract, leaving many questions unsettled, but recognizing that from now on the company would have to deal not with individuals, but with a union. In 1936, there were 48 sit-down strikes. In 1937, there were 477. Electrical workers in St. Louis, shirt workers in Pulaski, Tennessee, broom workers in Pueblo, Colorado, trash collectors in Bridgeport, Connecticut, grave diggers in New Jersey, 17 blind workers at the New York Guild for the Jewish Blind, prisoners in an Illinois penitentiary, and even 30 members of a National Guard company who had served in the Fisher Body sit-down and now sat down themselves because they had not been paid. The sit-downs were especially dangerous to the system because they were not controlled by the regular union leadership. An AFL business agent for the hotel and restaurant employees said, "You'd be sitting in the office any March day of 1937 and the phone would ring and the voice on the other end would say, 'My name is Mary Jones. I'm a soda clerk at Liggett's. We've thrown the manager out and we've got the keys. What do we do now?' and you'd hurry over to the company to negotiate, and over there they'd say, I think it's the height of irresponsibility to call a strike before you've ever asked for a contract. And all you could answer was, you're so right. It was to stabilize the system in the face of labor unrest that the Wagner Act of 1935, setting up a National Labor Relations Board, had been passed. The waves of strikes in 1936, 1937, 1938 made the need even more pressing. In Chicago on Memorial Day 1937, a strike at Republic Steel brought the police out, firing at a mass picket line of strikers, killing 10 of them. Autopsies showed the bullets had hit the workers in the back as they were running away. This was the Memorial Day massacre. But Republic Steel was organized, and so was Ford Motor Company and the other huge plants in steel, auto, rubber, meatpacking, the electrical industry. Now, I know a lot of folks who think that the police used to protect people over rich people's property, and this is, and we're talking more recently than this, and here they are in the 30s, and they're protecting rich people's property. The Wagner Act was challenged by a steel corporation in the courts, but the Supreme Court found it constitutional that the government could regulate interstate commerce and that strikes hurt interstate commerce. From the trade union's point of view, the new law was an aid to union organizing. From the government's point of view, it was an aid to the stability of commerce. Unions were not wanted by employers, but they were more controllable, more stabilizing for the system than the wildcat strikes, the factory occupations of the rank and file. In the spring of 1937, a New York Times article carried the headline, Unauthorized Sit-Downs Fought by CIO Unions. The story read, strict orders have been issued to all organizers and representatives that they will be dismissed if they authorize any stoppages of work without the consent of the international officers. The Times quoted John L. Lewis, dynamic leader of the CIO. A CIO contract is adequate protection against sit-downs, lie-downs, or any other kind of strike. The Communist Party, some of whose members played critical roles in organizing CIO unions, seemed to take the same position. One communist leader in Akron was reported to have said at a party strategy meeting after the sit-downs, "Now we must work for regular relations between the union and the employers, and strict observance of union procedure on the part of the workers." Thus, two sophisticated ways of controlling direct labor action developed in the mid-30s. First, the National Labor Relations Board would give unions legal status, listen to them, settling certain of their grievances. Thus, it could moderate labor rebellion by channeling energy into elections, just as the constitutional system channeled possibly troublesome energy into voting. The NLRB would set limits in economic conflict as voting did in political conflict. And second, the workers' organization itself, the union, even a militant and aggressive union like the CIO, would channel the workers' insurrectionary energy into contracts, negotiations, union meetings, and try to minimize strikes in order to build large, influential, even respectable organizations. The history of those years seems to support the argument of Richard Cloward and Francis Piven in their book Poor People's Movements, that labor won most during its spontaneous uprisings before the unions were recognized or well organized. Factory workers had their greatest influence and were able to exact their most substantial concessions from government during the Great Depression in the years before they were organized into unions. Their power during the Depression was not rooted in organization, but in disruption. Piven and Cloward point out that union membership rose enormously in the 40s. During the Second World War, the CIO and AFL had over 6 million members each by 1945, but its power was less than before. Its gains from the use of strikes kept getting whittled down. The members appointed to the National Labor Relations Board were less sympathetic to labor. The Supreme Court declared sit-downs to be illegal, and state governments were passing laws to hamper strikes, picketing, boycotts. Sorry, my throat is so dry. The coming of World War II weakened the old labor militancy of the 30s because the war economy created millions of new jobs at higher wages. The New Deal had succeeded only in reducing unemployment from 13 million to 9 million. It was the war that put almost everyone to work, and the war did something else. Patriotism, the push for unity of all classes against enemies overseas, made it harder to mobilize anger against the corporations. Let me read that again, because I think that applies today too, even though, well, we're at many wars, but I think that applies. Patriotism, the push for unity of all classes against enemies overseas, made it harder to mobilize anger against the corporations. During the war, the CIO and AFL pledged to call no strikes. It's throwing me off that they're saying that CIO and AFL instead of AFL-CIO. Still, the grievances of workers were such, wartime controls meant their wages were being controlled better than prices, that they felt impelled to engage in many wildcat strikes. There were more strikes in 1944 than in any previous year in American history, says Jeremy Brecher. The 30s and 40s showed more clearly than before the dilemma of working people in the United States. The system responded to workers' rebellions by finding new forms of control. Internal control by their own organizations, as well as outside control by law and force. But along with the new controls came new concessions. These concessions didn't solve basic problems. For many people, they solved nothing, but they helped enough people to create an atmosphere of progress and improvement to restore some faith in the system. The minimum wage of 1938, which established the 40-hour week and outlawed child labor, left many people out of its provisions and set very low minimum wages, 25 cents an hour the first year. But it was enough to dull the edge of resentment. Housing was built for only a small percentage of the people who needed it. A modest, even parsimonious beginning, Paul Conklin says. But the sight of federally subsidized housing projects, playgrounds, vermin-free apartments, replacing dilapidated tenements, was refreshing. The TVA suggested exciting possibilities for regional planning to give jobs, improve areas, and provide cheap power with local instead of national control. The Social Security Act gave retirement benefits and unemployment insurance and matched state funds for mothers and dependent children. But it excluded farmers, domestic workers, and old people and offered no health insurance. As Conklin says, the meager benefits of Social Security were insignificant in comparison to the building of security for large established businesses. The New Deal gave federal money to put thousands of writers, artists, actors, and musicians to work in a federal theater project, a federal writers project, a federal art project. Murals were painted on public buildings. Plays were put on for working class audiences who had never seen a play. Hundreds of books and pamphlets were written and published. People heard a symphony for the first time. It was an exciting flowering of the arts for the people, such as had never happened before in American history and which has not been duplicated since. But in 1939, with the country more stable and the New Deal reform impulse weakened, programs to subsidize the art were eliminated. When the New Deal was over, capitalism remained intact. The rich still controlled the nation's wealth, as well as its laws, court, police, newspapers, churches, colleges. Enough help had been given to enough people to make Roosevelt a hero to millions, but the same system that had brought depression and crisis, the system of waste, of inequality, of concern for profit over human need, remained. Almost sounds like the end of the chapter, but it's not quite. For black people, the New Deal was psychologically encouraging. Mrs. Roosevelt was sympathetic. Some blacks got posts in the administration, but most blacks were ignored by the New Deal programs. As tenant farmers, as farm laborers, as migrants, as domestic workers, they didn't qualify for unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, or farm subsidies. Roosevelt, careful not to offend Southern white politicians, that's important not to offend the Southern whites, whose political support he needed, did not push a bill against lynching. Blacks and whites were segregated in the armed forces, and black workers were discriminated against in getting jobs. They were the last hired, the first fired. Only when A. Philip Randolph, head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941 would Roosevelt agree to sign an executive order establishing a Fair Employment Practices Committee. But the FEPC had no enforcement powers and changed little. Black Harlem, with all the New Deal reforms, remained as it was. There 350,000 people lived, 233 persons per acre, compared with 133 for the rest of Manhattan. In 25 years, its population had multiplied 6 times. 10,000 families lived in rat-infested cellars and basements. Tuberculosis was common. Perhaps half of the married women worked as domestics. They traveled to the Bronx and gathered on street corners. Slave markets, they were called, to be hired. Prostitution crept in. 2 young black women, Ella Baker and Marvel, I have a feeling that's Marvell Cook, wrote about this in The Crisis in 1935. Not only is human labor bartered and sold for the slave wage, but human love is also a marketable commodity. Whether it is labor or love, the women arrive as early as 8 a.m. and remain as late as 1 p.m. or until they are hired. In rain or shine, hot or cold, they wait to work for 10, 15, and 20 cents per hour. In Harlem Hospital in 1932, proportionately twice as many people died as in Bellevue Hospital, which was in the white area downtown. Harlem was a place that bred crime. The bitter blossom of poverty, as Roy Otley and William Weatherby say in their essay, The Negro in New York. On March 19, 1935, even as the New Deal reforms were being passed, Harlem exploded. 10,000 Negroes swept through the streets, destroying the property of white merchants. 700 policemen moved in and brought order. 2 blacks were killed. In the mid-30s, a young black poet named Langston Hughes wrote a poem, Let America Be America Again. Almost sounds like a Donald Trump slogan. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. Yes? Okay, Langston Hughes. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek, and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me. Who made America? Whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again? Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again. America. To white Americans of the 30s, however, North and South, blacks were invisible. Only the radicals made an attempt to break the racial barriers. Socialists, Trotskyists, communists most of all. The CIO, influenced by the communists, was organizing blacks in the mass production industries. Blacks were still being used as strikebreakers, but now there were also attempts to bring blacks and whites together against their common enemy. A woman named Molly Lewis, writing in The Crisis in 1938, told of her experience in a steel strike in Gary, Indiana. While the municipal government of Gary continues to keep the children apart in a system of separate schools, their parents are getting together in the union and in the auxiliary. The only public eating place in Gary where both races may be freely served is a cooperative restaurant largely patronized by members of the union and auxiliary. When the black and white workers and members of their families are convinced that their basic economic interests are the same, they may be expected to make common cause for the advancement of these interests. There was no great feminist movement in the 30s, but many women became involved in the labor organizing of those years. A Minnesota poet, Meridel Lesueur, I don't know how to pronounce that, Seuer, was 34 when the great Teamsters strike tied up Minneapolis in 1934. She became active in it and later described her experiences. I have never been in a strike before. The truth is I was afraid. Do you need any help? I said eagerly. We kept on pouring thousands of cups of coffee, feeding thousands of men. The cars were coming back. The announcer cried, "This is murder." I saw them taking men out of cars and putting them on the hospital cots on the floor. The picket cars kept coming in. Some men have walked back from the market holding their own blood in. Men, women, and children are massing outside, a living circle close packed for protection. We have living blood on our skirts. Tuesday, the day of the funeral, 1,000 more militia were massed downtown. It was over 90 in the shade. I went to the funeral parlors and thousands of men and women were massed there, waiting in the terrific sun. One block of women and children were standing 2 hours waiting. I went over and stood near them. I didn't know whether I could march. I didn't like marching in parades. 3 women drew me in. "We want all to march," they said gently. "Come with us." Sylvia Woods spoke to Allison Stoughton Lind years later about her experiences in the 30s as a laundry worker and union organizer. You have to tell people things they can see. Then they'll say, "Oh, I never thought of that," or "I have never seen it like that." Like Tennessee, he hated black people, a poor sharecropper. He danced with a black woman, so I have seen people change. This is the faith you got to have in people. Many Americans began to change their thinking in those days of crisis and rebellion. In Europe, Hitler was on the march. Across the Pacific, Japan was invading China. The Western empires were being threatened by new ones. For the United States, war was not far off. And that'd be the end of that chapter. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell and you'll be notified when I make the new video. And we'll see you next time.